This is not financial nor professional advice. This video is for entertainment only. Hey everyone, I wanted to play an interview that's from Kitco News, and it's an interview of John Williams entitled Inflation is Really 15%. And I think it shows how manipulated the government figures really are regarding inflation and other figures as well.
Inflation has already risen to the highest level since the early 80s, but is set to climb even higher from here. Joining us now is John Williams. He is a founder of Shadow Stats, and John is an economist who is calculating inflation based on his own data and based on the metrics that the government used to use before they changed their methodology. John knows the things that the economy is not growing as quickly as is reported and has some grim news for the outlook of where we're headed. John, welcome back to the show. Honored to have you on Kitco.
Dave, thank you so much for having me.
John, let's start by talking about inflation first, and then we'll talk about your GDP forecast. Now, inflation is something that you've been tracking actively for a long time using your methodology. Well, not quite your methodology. You've explained to me in prior interviews that you're using the methodology that the government used to use before they've made an adjustment. Can you explain how that works?
Sure. Back in the early 1980s, the federal government decided that it was going to change the way the consumer price index was calculated because inflation was rising more rapidly than they wanted to see, and it meant that they had to have higher cost of living adjustments in the year ahead for people on Social Security, with the effect that if they could somehow bring down the reported CPI, it would reduce the cost of living adjustments that they would have to make. And I took offense at that because the whole concept of the consumer price index was to measure constant standard of living and to give people an honest adjustment to their Social Security payments or anything else that the government paid out.
I think I'm offended also. It does seem to be defeating the purpose of the original law, so it's not a good thing.
So when they started changing it, and before 1980, it was pretty stable and consistent. After 1980, the biggest change was they looked at housing, and where there had been a component in the housing cost reflecting the cost of owning your own home, they changed that to the new concept of homeowners equivalent rent, where the government would estimate how much it cost you to rent your own house, and then the monthly inflation rate was determined by how much the government determined that the homeowner would raise his rental rate on himself. Completely nonsense number, but it had the effect of knocking something like 1.5 percentage points off the aggregate CPI. And there were other changes made after that into the early 2000s. And if you look at what I did was just try to reverse engineer the changes that the government made, and over time, allowing for things to pretty much stabilize in the 2000 year frame, 2000 to 2010. Right now you're looking at an actual CPI that is closer to 7 or 8% above what the government's reporting.
So the government's reporting 7% on headline inflation, and you're saying we're at 15%?
Well, if you look at the latest numbers, this would be for December, the government's headline 7.0%.
Yeah.
Which is the highest in 40 years. Would have been 15.1% based on my estimation, which would make it the highest since 1947.
Imagine that, 15%. This is worse than the 1970s. I mean, that was kind of the height of the 1970s. It was 15 or 16%, and that was really bad.
And Harry Truman was president. I'm looking at the CPI the same way it was estimated before they started changing the approach in the 1980s.
Well, a lot of people would agree with you that just based on their everyday life, the CPI increase is much higher than 7%. I can attest to my grocery bills, for example. So why the underreporting by the government, you think?
It was deliberate. They changed the methodologies to reduce the headline reporting. In other words, one of the biggest, I think.
But why would they do that? What's the incentive? What's the political incentive to do that?
The political incentive, very simply, was to reduce government outlays in terms of cost of living adjustments.
That's one motivation, but there's a thing with inflation. If you tell people that prices are going to keep rising dramatically, people will buy in anticipation of prices going up. And so inflation expectations actually leads to more inflation. So by lowering the number, they lower the expectation that there will be inflation. So you prevent a self-fulfilling prophecy where inflation expectations makes for dramatically more inflation.
Significant. I mean, people on Social Security, there are all sorts of areas where you have pensions and the variety of government payments that are will tend to be adjusted for the headline CPI. And if you reduce the CPI reporting for the last year, that means that from where it would have been, it means the government has to shell out less in the way of cash. It means they have a smaller budget deficit. Back in the days where Newt Gingrich was trying to negotiate higher, a greater cutback in the CPI with the Catherine Abrams of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, according to her memoirs, he said, "Gee, if you could only find your way to make these corrections to the numbers for us, we might find more money for the Bureau of Labor Statistics." She didn't do those changes, but that's the type of concept that the Congress had come up with, was to artificially suppress the consumer inflation as reported, with the idea of reducing, as a way of helping to reduce the federal budget deficit without anyone having to cut back on programs.
Well, John, do you think this may also be a tactic from the part of the Federal Reserve to fight inflation? Presumably, if you have a report that shows really high levels of inflation, double digits according to your estimates, then employers around the country would have to adjust for that and raise wages in the double digits every year just to keep up with inflation. Of course, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you raise wages and the costs go up, everything else goes up in prices. So you want to underreport to combat that rise in wages and other prices. Wouldn't you want to do that?
Well, that's correct, and the Fed was sympathetic and helpful here, at least under the auspices of Alan Greenspan. He backed it, and he put out similar. He put argument he used, and again, it goes against the original concept. The whole way of looking at the consumer price index as a way of measuring a constant standard of living. What he said was, well, look, if steak goes up in price, people are going to buy more chicken. And that may be true. But that's not maintaining a constant standard of living. Mm-hmm. The idea was to have inflation increase so that people didn't have to shift their mode of living from shopping at the big private stores to the mass shopping centers because they couldn't afford the more expensive stuff at the other stores, which has happened. The whole concept of the CPI was altered in various stages, so that right now, if you looked at it the way it had been, you'd be looking at something closer to my 15% instead of 7%.
And you told me offline that 15% is not the final number. We're expecting, or at least you are expecting, an even higher inflation reading in the future, right?
Well, we're in a period now of rapidly rising inflation, and I'm not seeing any signs that it's about to let up. Part of that's tied to the quantitative easing that the Federal Reserve has entered in terms of the pandemic. They didn't have too much choice in the matter. They had to do something to prevent a systemic collapse.
I think this interview gives a nice summary of the psychological, financial, and political, probably primarily political reasons the figures on inflation should be adjusted upwards at least 7% right now, maybe 8% right now. So it comes out to being at least 15% if you look at the real rate of inflation. Thanks for watching the video. Please like and subscribe so that you receive future notifications of future videos. I plan to do a video next on some perhaps overlooked companies that possibly a person could think of investing in now, although I'm bearish on the market right now, but a person might start looking at these as possible ins on this difficult market, which is constantly changing. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the future.